Hi everybody, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor. Today we're going to talk about a tough topic. It's really a difficult one for a lot of us who have suffered from complex trauma. It's grief. Yeah, grief. So this is the emotion that I think a lot of us have parts that are running from. You know, in my other video when I went over internal family systems therapy, or IFS, we talked about a lot of the wounded parts and how we develop protectors that kind of protect us from feeling some of these really painful emotions. And grief is one of them. By the way, I'll link the video for my IFS slideshow. I'll link it below. So please do check the description below if you would like to know more. It's really an informative video. It covers IFS in great detail, which is an amazing, amazing therapy modality for complex trauma survivors. So you'll notice I'll probably talk a little bit about some of the parts and relate IFS to the grief process as well, because yeah, there are definitely protective parts that keep us safe while we are growing up with complex trauma, and kind of keep those really difficult emotions of like sadness and anger and fear and depression and grief at bay, because really we had to focus on survival. You know, we didn't have time to feel these very distressing, deep emotions. So yeah, but part of our recovery process as somebody who has gone through complex trauma and, you know, childhood abuse and neglect, it's very, very important that we finish the grief process. So, you know, I've worked with tons and tons of clients over the many years that I've been a therapist now. And this is a subject that comes up inevitably at some point during trauma therapy, and that's grief. And it's an emotion that I would say most of us run from. It's not pleasant to experience. It's heavy. It's hard. I think a lot of us feel like, well, if I could just kind of ignore it or stay busy or, you know, numb it through maybe substances or overworking or, yeah, any other number of protectors. Again, those managers, those firefighters from IFS. If I could just keep the emotion at bay, I'll be fine. I can survive. But the real truth is that grief is normal, it's healthy, and we need to go through it to heal from complex trauma. You can't escape the grieving process if you really want to truly heal from complex trauma. So I'll talk about the 5 stages of grief and how they apply to healing from our abusive childhoods. It's a little bit different than, say, the grief process from losing a loved one to an actual death, for example. So the grief process is similar in some ways and different in other ways, and I'll cover that too. All right, so let's go over the first stage of grief. And just to point out too, I want to make sure that people understand that the stages of grief are not linear. In other words, you don't just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next until you're finally done. It actually is a very messy process. And grief, what it actually looks like, you know, is like boop, 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 boop. And, you know, it's like all over the place. And that's normal. It's a very organic process. It takes a unique trajectory for everyone, and it's definitely not linear. It can be quite messy. And that's normal too. I tell my clients, you can go in and out of the stages. You can go 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. It's okay. It's okay. It's normal, and it will pass. This is one of those things that the more we fight our pain and the more we run from our pain, the more the distress goes up. So this is one of those things that learning kind of radical acceptance and recognizing that pain will not last forever and that we can get through it is super, super important. I also teach my clients to think of grief like ocean waves. You know, that any distressing emotion, and grief included, is like an ocean wave. It begins and it has a crest and it goes up right here at the peak. But then if we don't stop it, so if we aren't numbing and avoiding and, you know, distracting and any other number of things that those protectors do, IFS there, you know, those managers and firefighters do to kind of keep the painful emotions at bay, if we don't start any of those behaviors, the grief will naturally go down and it will subside. And so that is the key thing to keep in mind here. Grief is normal when you've experienced traumatic loss. It is normal. It is part of life, and it's okay. And it will pass. And by not fighting it and not avoiding it, what you learn is that it will pass. All right. So what's interesting about grief now, with complex trauma in particular, is that oftentimes, instead of acceptance being the last stage of grief, in many ways, acceptance is the first stage of grief when it comes to abusive families. And why is that? Well, because until we finally accept the reality that our parent or abusive family member is who they are, and that there is nothing we can do to change that, then the grief process really can't start. So what it really looks like for us, for example, and the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, then acceptance. But what it actually looks like for us is we are in such a huge state of denial for much of our lives that our family is actually abusive. So what we really do is we like people please and we fawn, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn. We're people pleasing, we're fawning, we're trying to keep the abuser happy. We're so desperate to be loved by an abusive parent or caregiver or family member that we would do just about anything, tying ourselves into a pretzel knot, for goodness sake, to try to keep these people happy and to be loved. We so desperately want to be loved by them. And so actually what we typically do until we come into therapy is we're attempting to get our needs met and to get love in a variety of ways, including twisting ourselves into knots and people pleasing and fawning and doing all of that. So that usually is what a survivor comes into therapy is kind of in that stage of just like, we call that like bargaining and denial, right? Well, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am blowing things out of proportion. Maybe I am the crazy one. They say I'm crazy. Maybe I am the problem. Let me get into therapy. Let me work on myself. Maybe if I work on myself, my relationship with my family will improve and maybe they'll finally love me. And so we're in a total state of denial, and we go into therapy and we really struggle with incredibly low self-worth, incredible wounds of like unworthiness and not feeling lovable and not feeling good enough. IFS, those exiles, right? Those are those original wounds. And so we come into therapy with those original wounds and we're just a hot mess and we have no idea what we're doing. And that we are still holding out some hope that either we could change ourselves or maybe we could change our family member in some way and maybe we can find some happiness that way. Yeah, so that's denial, that's bargaining. That's what it looks like for complex trauma survivors. But that's not actually going to heal us. Yeah. So actually what really happens is you get into therapy, you start working with a good trauma therapist, hopefully, if you can find one, and you start to recognize, oh my goodness, I really have been abused. I wasn't imagining it. These experiences, as I'm sharing with this neutral third party, are horrific and definitely traumatic and abusive. And this person is validating my experiences. First time I've ever had my experiences validated, right? We get into trauma therapy with a good therapist. We're like, oh my God, somebody believes me. I'm not crazy. I myself, I remember back, many years ago when I was in trauma therapy myself, I asked my own therapist, I can't tell you how many times, are you sure it's not me? Are you sure I'm not crazy? No, you're not crazy. She had to tell me that so many times because our abusive families gaslight us so badly that we don't even know what's reality anymore and we don't trust ourselves. And, that's part of the horrific, psychological abuse and emotional abuse that we go through in our families of origin. So we don't come in knowing what's even reality. And you can't really grieve a loss until you recognize it's a loss. So that's when the tides turn. And what usually happens then is as you're pouring out your heart and all of the experiences you went through, and you're getting that neutral third party really understanding you for the first time, you're feeling somebody understand you and they're compassionate and they're validating, and you start to recognize, my God, I really am an abuse survivor. And you start to recognize, my God, there's nothing I can do to fix these people that I love so much and I so desperately want to be loved by, and I want to feel safe with, and I want to be connected with. And there's nothing I can do to change them. There's nothing I can do to change them. And there's definitely, it's not about changing me because I've been abused, actually. We don't want to twist ourselves into pretzels for abusive people, good for goodness sake. No, that's not authentic self. Again, right? IFS, our authentic self is not safe in our families of origin. We can't be ourselves around them. But in therapy, you're learning how to finally be your authentic self, and learning that you can be safe with others and be your authentic self at the same time. So finally it hits us, oh my goodness, I have an abusive family, and there's nothing I can do to change them. Now what? Ooh, that's when the grief starts. That's when the grief starts, and the deep, deep sadness. But first, for me, actually, what happened was I got angry. So anger is one of those stages. And what's so interesting about anger that I want to point out, a lot of us come into therapy denying our own anger. For us, a lot of us, especially women, there are some gender influences here. Not to say that men might not struggle with this as well, but there's definitely more of a gender influence with women and anger specifically. A lot of women have not been taught that anger is an acceptable emotion, and certainly not been allowed to express anger. What was interesting in my family of origin, everyone else could express anger and violence even, and shouting and screaming, but God forbid you actually have a negative emotion. That was not allowed. It's not allowed whatsoever. Shut that down. If you have any emotion, you keep that to yourself. So a lot of us come in with those type of messages. So we are very much not in touch with our own emotions. Many of my clients, for example, cannot even recognize the variety and different shades of the same emotion. Like, you might be able to recognize sadness or anger, but there's so much more layers underneath those emotions. Emotion wheels are great for this, by the way. Feel free to look some emotion wheels up. What you'll see is that they might put like an emotion of anger, but then they'll spread that out into a variety of different emotions, such as rage or betrayal or, sadness, for example. So you'll see a whole other range of emotions underneath the primary emotion. Anger is a primary emotion. Anger is also a strong protector. So that's, again, bringing back an IFS concept. Anger is a primary protector. I like to say anger is SAD's big brother, because anger usually is the primary protector of more vulnerable parts that hold a lot of pain. It's like the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. What you see on the surface might be anger, but what's hiding underneath is such a devastating amount of pain. And so anger is SAD's big brother. And anger typically comes first before SAD. Although not always, everybody has a unique trajectory. And what I found was I needed to accept my anger because it was justified. When you are an abuse survivor, you have been violated. You have been violated in any number of ways. And it is normal and healthy to be angry about being violated. We were taught in our families of origin that we were not allowed to be angry. Everyone else could. The abuser could, certainly. We were not allowed to be angry. No. And so part of what we do in trauma therapy is we learn that every single emotion is valuable. Emotions themselves are not bad. Emotions are packets of information that tells you something very important about your safety. So things like anger and sadness are cues that something is wrong. Something is wrong, and that you need to pay attention to it. And especially when we've been violated, for example. So anger is your first primary emotion that during the grieving process, it's okay to get angry. So I tell my clients, maybe write some letters. Not that we send the letters to the abusers, but let's start writing all of our emotions out and just get them out. Just carte blanche, don't, censor yourself. Sit down and write out how you feel. It's so important. We're beginning to use our voice for the first time. A lot of what we experienced as children is that we were stripped of our voice. And when you're stripped of your voice, you're stripped of your humanity. So we want to give you back your humanity by giving you your voice back. So your anger is an acceptable emotion when you have been harmed and abused. And I like to say anger, is not a destructive emotion when used wisely. Anger, used constructively, can be used for good, great change in the world. Martin Luther King comes to mind. Anger used constructively and for justice purposes is a beautiful, beautiful, empowering emotion that can produce great change. And it produces great change in us too when we get angry enough to recognize we were abused and we didn't deserve it and that it should stop now. So anger is going to be that primary protector that says, you will not treat me like that anymore. I am done. I am done being a doormat for you, and I'm done being a victim. It's not going to happen anymore. And then what happens is after the anger comes a great, devastating sadness. And sadness is the emotion that most of the time, back to IFS here, you got protectors really keeping that deep, deep, depressing and crushing sadness at bay because it's very heavy and it's devastating. And it's when a part of you finally recognizes that you will never get the love that you so desperately wanted and deserved from your family. And that's very hard. And there's no easy way around this. It is just an emotion that needs to be felt. Again, that beautiful ocean wave analogy. It goes up, it has a peak, but then if you don't fight it, it will naturally go back down and it will subside. And it may take some time. I myself spent months and months crying and grieving with my therapist, and then oscillating back to anger sometimes, and then crying and grieving, and then maybe going back in the fog a little bit where you're like, I don't know, am I crazy? Are you sure it's not me? No, Mary, it's not you. You were abused. Yeah. So you can see how you can kind of go back and forth between the stages. But at the end of the tunnel, when you're all done grieving and crying and the anger subsides, what you find is this beautiful end, acceptance. So ironically, the grief starts with acceptance of the reality of what we're dealing with, but it also ends with acceptance that really, we not only were we abused, yes, but also that we are not blaming ourselves anymore. And we're seeing things with clarity. So IFS again, where some self-energy has entered the picture for the first time. And those 8 C's of self, just like I mentioned in my IFS video, clarity being one of them. You can clearly see the picture now for what it was without those very strong emotions or very rigid black and white thinking. There's an absence of that. You can see it for what it really is, and a deep acceptance enters the picture. That's when you know that you have gotten over the grief of losing a family that you never really had in the first place, ironically. I tell my clients, I think for me and for what a lot of them, what I see as well, it's very similar for a lot of us. The last thing that I had to grieve was the hope that things would be any different and the hope that my parent would love me. That was the last bit that I had to let go of before I could finally reach acceptance. Until I let go of that one last little thread of hope that I could change me, or I could change my parent, or I could do anything different. Until I could let go of that, there was not really an end stage of grief for me. That had to come crashing down before acceptance entered the picture. And that's a very, very hard thing to let go of, the one last little thread of hope. Because the reality is, as I've said in a lot of my other videos, if we could have fixed the relationship, if it was fixable, it would have been done so many, many years prior, right? None of us have gotten to this point, for example, where we're in therapy, were thinking about going no contact. Complex PTSD is on board in full force. We have not gotten here over just minor things here and there, right? You know, healthy people with healthy families don't come into therapy with these type of issues. They just don't. They don't. You know, this, and of course, as I like to say, you know, with a bit of humor, of course, tongue in cheek, so to speak, you know, that the people who come to therapy are the ones coming to therapy to deal with those who don't go to therapy. Ironically, you know, you don't really see highly disordered, like personality disorder type of individuals that do a lot of harm. You don't see them coming into therapy. What you see are victims coming into therapy. And that I can say, you know, through my almost 10 years of being a therapist now, yeah, it's victims who come into therapy, not the abuser. Once in a great while, you might see an abuser come into therapy, but for the most part, it's victims. So, yeah, I hope that some of this has been helpful for you. And I just want to let you know that grief is normal. It's part of the process of healing from complex PTSD. You can't really heal from complex PTSD until you go through this grief process. So it is a very necessary process. And I reassure all my clients, you know, this is the light at the end of the tunnel is that you reach a deep stage of acceptance. And really what that looks like is you can see your family again with that clarity, even with compassion, especially in the later stages of healing, especially when we do, again, IFS, those self and parts, you begin to even see your wounded, you know, your parents, for example, as wounded grown children. You know, they're grown wounded children. You know, they are adults, but really have never grown beyond the age of a young child themselves. And they could not parent you in any sort of healthy way. And they wounded you. You know, again, my other videos too on generational trauma, right? This is patterns that have gone far back in the family tree. So not only are you seeing things clearly, and even with some compassion that the suffering has gone on as long as it has in the family tree, but also compassion for yourself, most of all, compassion for yourself. And finally, you feel this deep sense of love for yourself, this deep sense of peace that you are okay, you have always been worthy, that it was never your fault what happened to you, and that you can still live a meaningful life. And yeah, so that's kind of what the latter stages of grief and healing from complex PTSD look like. And yeah, so I hope this has been helpful. No doubt there will be other videos, you know, with similar topics, because I know this is an important topic to a lot of people. You know, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me any comments below. I'm happy to answer any questions. You know, feel free to definitely, you know, your support is so important. You know, like the video, subscribe to my channel. There'll be a lot more. But yeah, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, you know, my heart is with all of you because I know firsthand how hard this grieving process is. But I also know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And once we are done with the grief process, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty good after that. And that's when we really can begin to step into our beautiful self-energy, that self-leadership, right? And a lot of our wounded parts settle down too. So anyways, yeah, I hope all this has been helpful. And again, it's been so lovely talking to all of you. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Take care.